Ruth Shedd. I'm the coordinator of Indigenous Achievement at the U of M. First, I'd like to welcome everyone here, and I would like to remind everyone where we're gathered. We are gathered on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. So this is our Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series. We started it in September. Dr. Barry LaValle started us off with lots of good topics and things to move forward with. This term, we're trying to bring some of the talks to Bannatyne campus. So this is our first time to talk at Bannatyne campus, and it's great to see such a good turnout. Every second talk will be here, so you can go to umanitoba.ca/indigenous for the dates and locations. So the ones at Bannatyne are on Tuesdays, and the ones at Fort Garry are on Thursdays. Again, this talk is being streamed on Facebook, so welcome to everyone who's watching online. There will be time for questions and answers at the end, so if you are on Facebook, you can leave a comment in the comments section, and we will share them with Dr. Anderson. So on that note, I will introduce Dr. Anderson. Dr. Marcia Anderson is a Cree Anishinaabe woman who grew up in the north end of Winnipeg, with roots going to the Norway House Cree Nation and Pig Whispers Nation in Manitoba. She practices both internal medicine and public health as a medical officer of health with the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority. She is the executive director of Indigenous Academic Affairs in the Ungamazin. I said that wrong. I practiced it so many times. I was right? Okay. Indigenous Institute of Health and Healing, Rady Faculty of Health Sciences here at the University of Manitoba. Her current active areas of work include leading the development and implementation of Truth and Reconciliation Response Action Plans, Indigenous Youth Health, culturally safe sexual health care, and Indigenous healthcare quality. She serves as the chair of the Indigenous Health Network of the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada and on multiple Indigenous health committees of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. She was recognized for her contributions to Indigenous peoples' health with a National Aboriginal Achievement Award in March 2011, and I told her before this talk that I've kind of been following her career for a really long time, and I'm a little bit intimidated because she's so accomplished, and it's just such an honor to get to hear her speak today. And to just top that off, in 2018 she was named one of the 100 most fascinating people in Manitoba and one of the 100 most powerful women in Canada. So please welcome Dr. Marcia Anderson.
I too would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 1 territory, which is the territory of my ancestors. It's the territory of my family right now, and it's the territory that my descendants will live, work, play, and receive healthcare and education in. And that is, of course, the core motivation for the work that I do, is progressing to the place where we have equality of opportunity, the full expression of our human rights. Now, I was asked to do this talk and put in the title and objectives before the intense period of media scrutiny that we're in right now, which makes this no less relevant, although may make it a little bit more uncomfortable for some. The talk is not just about the university, but it's also not about the university, right? And it's based on the 15 years of leadership work I've had in Indigenous medical education, and many of the common barriers that I've experienced in trying to advance the work. Barriers that make it difficult, if not at times impossible, to achieve shared goals, or at least goals that are stated to be shared. And barriers that if we don't start talking about and addressing, we're not going to be able to move forward in a constructive way. Now, on February 7th, the president of the university did release a statement on how we needed to work collectively to address the intolerably high levels of racism that are still present in our institution. And one of the things that he said is that sometimes we need help to see how the racism is operating, both interpersonally and systemically. So I'm going to take him at his word for that. I've also been doing a lot of reading about learning organizations. And I would suggest that if we're not gonna approach this as a learning organization, we're not gonna be able to get anywhere. And there are three key kind of principles or factors that need to be in place for us to be a learning organization. One is that it has to be safe for individuals and collectives to develop and work towards a vision. Okay? There needs to be a relentless commitment to the truth and to uncovering the truth. And thirdly, it has to be safe to challenge the status quo, particularly when challenging the status quo leads to uncomfortable conversations and questions. Now, the other preamble note that I'd like to make is I've set up this talk to have a dichotomy in it, an obvious us and them, which will become apparent. My position in this is as an Anishinaabe, as an Indigenous woman, who works in an institution that has colonial roots and is built on a system of whiteness. And I'll get into that more. Now, you may have your own way that you experience these 10 things that I'm going to describe, one or more of them, as an us or as a them. But it's important that we acknowledge this is actually a false dichotomy, right? Like I am both us and them by virtue of my choice to be working within the system as part of the system to dismantle some of these really harmful barriers. At the same time though, as I'm both us and them, we have to also acknowledge that I can never be fully them. Right? So, jumping on into this, the first way that organizations do not set themselves up for success in their Indigenous achievement, anti-racism, reconciliation, diversity, or inclusion goals is they don't actually know what it is they're doing, right? I have 3 of these listed in my job description. They're Indigenous achievement, reconciliation, and anti-racism. And these 3 are intrinsically linked if we are doing them right, okay? So the colonial relationship that requires a rights-based approach to reconciliation is rooted fundamentally in racism. It was rooted in the initial white settlers coming here believing they were superior, that they had a superior approach to civilization, and that we were inferior savages. And this was the root of all of the assimilationist policies that flowed from that, including but not limited to residential schools. And so the work of reconciliation cannot advance without specific and dedicated attention to anti-racism, since it is the root of the colonial relationship. Now, if we want to talk about Indigenous achievement for a moment, the barriers to Indigenous achievement are not inherent to Indigenous people. It is not like we have inherently, genetically, a lower level of achievement that we can achieve, right? The barriers to Indigenous achievement are a manifestation of multi-level racism, full stop. So we can think about institutional racism, which is the differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. That is evolutionary and embedded in structures like policy and legislation. And that often is represented as inaction in the face of need. And so one, pretty obvious example of this is the chronic underfunding of First Nations education, right? 20 to 30% less per First Nation student going to school on reserve compared to a student going to a provincially operated school. And so it's a completely expected and rational outcome that if you attend a school that is funded at least 30% less than any other school in the province, that the population of students graduating from that school prepared for university entrance is going to be lower, right? Like it's a completely expected outcome. So that is how institutional racism is a barrier to Indigenous achievement rather than inherent Indigenous potential. Interpersonal racism, so the kind of between one another, identifiable perpetrator, identifiable impact, also impacts Indigenous achievement. And I'm going to use the example of medical school admissions to highlight this. So one commonly used tool for medical school's admission is called the multiple mini interview, or MMI. And what it is, it's basically a bell ringer type interview. The potential applicants move through a number of different stations. Each one is situational. It's meant to assess kind of professionalism, critical thought, relatability, communication, things like that. And each station is rated by an interviewer, right? Now, the thing with the MMI is it's well known to be racially biased for a number of different reasons, including that raters systematically rate lower people they racialize as Black or Indigenous or Hispanic, for example. So one medical school in the United States had everybody who was going to be participating in these MMIs, who was going to be rating potential medical students, do what's called the implicit association test. This is a very well-validated tool developed out of Harvard, used in many, many, many studies at this point, that assesses for implicit pro-white anti-Black bias in its original form. There are many other forms of the IAT now. So they had everyone who was going to be rating these students do this IAT. They went through their admission cycles, did the MMIs, they sent them a survey after. What was interesting was on the survey, 50% of the people who responded said that while they were doing the MMIs and rating potential students, they were aware of what their IAT results were. First time they were aware of their bias during this process. Almost 30% said it actually impacted how they rated students. And the impact of that on the medical school makeup in that cycle was that they had the most racially diverse class they ever had. So when we don't intervene in interpersonal racism, it has very real consequences for students who are racialized as Black or Indigenous. So that is why the work of Indigenous Achievement and the work of reconciliation have to be rooted in the work of anti-racism. You cannot have either of those without anti-racism. And that's mainly what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time that we have. Now, why not diversity and inclusion, you might be asking, and why am I going to kind of drop those concepts from here on out? So for one thing, they lack a critical theory basis, which means they generally do not examine underlying power structures or barriers. They're not Indigenous specific, so often they are working on kind of a multicultural or melting pot model. And they often lack attention to the structural roots that create the lack of diversity. So again, one quick study that I'll tell you about. I was reading the Rotman School of Management magazine last year. They had an inequality issue. And they published a study of the hiring practices of organizations with a stated diversity mandate. It was a US-based study, so they were looking predominantly at Black and Hispanic peoples. And one thing we're probably mainly aware of in this room is that there is significant racism in hiring practices, right? So if your name is racialized as something other than white, you're less likely to have your resume read, you're less likely to get called in for an interview, and thus you're less likely to get a job. That has been well described throughout the literature. So the study describes how Black and Hispanic people then often strategically, quote unquote, whitewash their resumes. So they will make their names sound less ethnic. If their student activities were all, so for example, if a Black person's student activities were all related to Black student associations and their volunteer work was all in the Black community and most of their employment had been in Black organizations, strategically they will likely drop the parts that identify those organizations and involvements within the Black community to increase their chances of getting called for the interview. This is a phenomenon known as whitewashing the resume. So what the study demonstrated was that when organizations have a stated diversity mandate, that Black and Hispanic people feel like they don't need to do this then. So they present their real names and the full names of the organizations that they have been involved with. The problem is this leaves them actually relatively more disadvantaged because organizations with the stated diversity mandate in this study did not actually have any difference in their hiring practices, which meant that they discriminated more against people who did not strategically whitewash their resumes. And that's the problem if we take a diversity approach without looking at the structural causes of the lack of diversity. Now this leads into my next point, where organizations set themselves up for lack of success, which is they focus on the people who are being disadvantaged as the focus of intervention, as opposed to the structures that cause disadvantage. So, for example, if we think about students who are experiencing racism at the University of Manitoba, Did anybody look at the president's message from February 7th online? Yeah, okay. So there was a lot of good stuff in there, I will say. I mean, first of all, that he put it out there that we need to do some collective work on addressing racism. That's a positive move. He provided 7 examples of initiatives that are intended to support Indigenous students, celebrate Indigenous cultures, share Indigenous knowledge, welcome some new Indigenous scholars in, etc. The message recognizes that it's not enough and can't be if we do not do work to address the persistent racism. And this is, like I said, overall positive. But when I look at that, I think we shouldn't be surprised that the racism is ongoing, because none of those 7 interventions listed actually targeted racism. They targeted the resilience of Indigenous learners, or the fun parts of Indigenous culture and having that highlighted. None of them were actually targeted at addressing racism. So if we were in an organization that wanted to address racism, we might instead ask ourselves questions like this. If we want to have a learning community or a workplace that is free of racism, do our admissions policies and our hiring practices explicitly address and support this? Are there clear policies on anti-racism that are regularly and transparently applied? Are there visible consequences for behaviors that are racist? And at the same time, are there visible rewards for the people who are doing the hard work of anti-racism? Now, this leads in to my next observation, how organizations can get in their own way, which is that they might have high-level goals of Indigenous achievement or reconciliation or anti-racism, but they don't embed their goals across policies, business practices, or operations, and thus they reinforce the status quo instead of aggressively pursuing the type of organizational cultural change that is necessary. And quite often, in fact, decision-making may visibly undermine the stated goals. Now, I alluded to this already, but specifically I will state that who gets hired and who gets promoted in an organization sends very strong messages about what actually matters most and what the real level of commitment is to this type of organizational cultural change. The example I want to use here is actually not race specific, but it's gender specific, because a lot of our organizations have stated gender equity and gender justice commitments. And it's actually an Ontario example, and I don't know, has anybody seen some of the media coverage about the Ontario emergency room chief who did not hire a single woman in 16 years? Yeah. The crazy part is, he wasn't fired, he resigned. Okay? Now, I look at a story like that, and one of the first things I think is, do we actually believe that there was no red flags in his behaviors before he got promoted to a position where he could influence hiring for 16 years? Did this come out of the blue as a surprise to everybody involved? Really unlikely, right? Really, really unlikely. And then I might ask, how did this continue unchecked for 16 years? Like, did an organization really believe that in 16 years there was not a single female emergency room physician who was qualified? So I think this type of practice that may seem extreme, it may not if we knew more about what was going on in our own workplaces, raises clear questions about the organization's commitment to gender fairness and equity, and I would suggest there are more parallels that we could open our eyes to rather than less. Now, the follow-up question to this that I will often get is about qualifications and meritocracy, right? So we might wonder where resistance to this kind of organizational change comes from, and quite often it comes from a belief that the policies, the knowledge, the processes are objective, they're colorblind, i.e. we don't see color, we treat everybody fairly, and that their organization is a meritocracy. So the example I'm going to use again is medical school admissions in general. And I will acknowledge that we've done a lot of work here, so I'm not specifically talking about our processes, and I'll refer to them specifically here a bit later. 17 medical schools in Canada. Most of them use a combination of so-called evidence-based tools, including grade point average or GPA, the Medical College Admissions Test or MCAT, the MMI, which I previously referred to, and this kind of newer tool called the Casper, which is kind of like the MMI, except it's computer-based, and it's done as part of the screen in for interview as opposed to the actual interview. Now, the theory behind this is that there is actual evidence that students who score higher on these kind of tests score higher later on other multiple choice tests in medical school. So they'll do well on other exams in medical school. It's much harder to score or to correlate how those tests correlate with actual clinical practice or actual professionalism or actual positive relationships as a physician. But there is some evidence that they correlate with exam performance later on. There is also evidence, however, that all 4 of those are racially biased tests, right? And so I do a lot of work on admissions committees and participate in discussions on national level admissions policies. And one of the questions that I have raised, and people in this room have heard me raise, is what is the cumulative disadvantaging effect of using now 4 tools that are all known to be racially biased against students who are racialized as Black and Indigenous? What is the cumulative effect of that racial disadvantage from us knowingly using racially biased tools? We might also ask, why are we willing to accept this cumulative disadvantage? And we might actually flip the question around. And if we flip it around, we could ask the question this way: what is the cumulative advantage to white people of us using only tools that are known to be racially biased against people who are racialized as Black or Indigenous? Because if one group is systematically advantaged by our choice to use exclusively racially biased tools, can we really believe that we have a meritocracy? Now, this will lead into my next point in the argument I'm building, which is that one way that organizations get in their own way is that they don't name or attend to whiteness except to uphold it. Now, I'm quite aware, that everybody got a lot more uncomfortable in the room with this particular statement. And so I want to tell you why we specifically need to have these conversations, okay? In racism, there is no neutral. It's not like I am disadvantaged by being visibly First Nations, but other people are neutral. It is that the disadvantage of some, as I illustrated above with those admissions tools, advantages others. And in a society that is constructed along lines of racial inferiority and injustice, like our colonial state is at its root, the group of people that is advantaged by that system are people who are racialized as white. And this is what the system of whiteness is. It's not about an individual white person, their intent, their individual life story. It's about the cumulative advantage that a population experiences and has the power to uphold. Okay? So racism exists in our society because some people benefit from it. If it was just neutral and disadvantaged, we'd probably have a lot more buy-in to dismantling it, right? So if we are not having conversations about who is benefiting from the racism that is ongoing, interpersonally, institutionally, systemically, through policies, through legislation, then we are not actually attending to the whiteness. Now, the work of anti-racism in which there is no neutral, requires that we actively work to disrupt that system of whiteness, okay? Now, this again leads to my next point, which is this. Organizations have a threshold for how much disruption to whiteness they will tolerate. Often, they will not tell us what it is, or they will pretend that there isn't one. So, I am going to refer specifically to our medical school's policies now for a moment. So if you looked at our medical school admissions policies, you would see that we actually ask students about their socioeconomic, racial, ethnic background. The purpose for this comes from the intention of trying to address some of the disadvantage that is inherent in the tools that we use. So since we know that we use a host of tools that are biased against racialized populations who are underrepresented in our medical school class, we will actually multiply their competitive score by a specific multiplier to try to mitigate some of that disadvantage, okay? Now, one question that I asked was, if we don't actually understand the quantitative cumulative effect of the 4 tools that we use that lead to racial disadvantage, then how do we know how much of that disadvantage we are actually mitigating by this multiplier effect? Like, where did we come up with that number? Where does that number come from? And the next question I ask is, how does palatability enter the decision into what that multiplier effect is? And what do I mean by that? Okay, so one thing I hear very commonly also is that white men are now the most disadvantaged group when it comes to getting into medicine. Oh no, seriously. And part of the reason where this argument comes from is basically white middle-class straight men are the only group who don't get any kind of multiplier in this score. Okay? So if we were to actually estimate that the cumulative effect of the racial disadvantage is like 75%. So people are going to systematically score 75% lower in their competitive rank score because of this cumulative racial disadvantage. And I said we should thus multiply everybody's scores by 1.7% who are racialized as Black or Indigenous, grew up low income, experience or identify as queer, for example. If I said that, it would not pass, right? Because there is a hard limit to the amount of disadvantage or the amount of advantage that people are willing to give up, rooted in who is currently being advantaged, right? So we get to say we're doing something because we have a multiplier. We don't actually know what percentage of the disadvantage that we're mitigating, and there is a significant part of the advantage that is thus maintained. Okay. Now, another way I would look at this, and the tension that gets created, is to consider the U.S. example, the U.S. for an example, okay? And even before Trump's election, although we've certainly seen this multiply since then, there is a solid portion of the U.S. population that when they look at the injustice and inequality Black people face, feel like you should be happy by now. We've got rid of slavery, we abolished the Jim Crow laws, like now it's time for you to pull up your own socks, right? And so this is the threshold of what they were willing to do. And then for Black people, as I would say for my own family, my own community, the actual thing that is being aimed for is the full expression of one's and collective human rights. The right to equality of opportunity, the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And there's quite a gap between the abolishment of slavery and the revoking of Jim Crow laws and the full expression of human rights for Black people in the United States. And that is the space of tension, right? Now, that gap exists here for us also. It exists in this medical school and this university, between what the university is willing to do and what we need to accomplish the full expression of our rights in this institution. That gap exists at the Regional Health Authority, where I also work, when it comes to providing high quality healthcare that is free of racism for Indigenous people. And one of the problems with this gap is when organizations start to label us as destructively disruptive, when we cross that threshold of what they're willing to do to dismantle whiteness and the advantage that whiteness confers, regardless of whether their own stated commitments for reconciliation or Indigenous achievement or healthcare that is free of racism have been achieved, or more likely have not been achieved, right? Now, this plays out in very predictable ways in organizations, well described in the literature. The story goes like this. Organization A commits to anti-racism. Racialized employee brings attention to a situation or practice that is experienced as racist. Management hears from the employee's colleagues that the way employee brought up the issue was angry or confrontational. The issue is now the racialized employee's behavior, as opposed to the problem or practice that the racialized employee was trying to bring attention to. The racialized employee's chances for advancement within the organization have effectively been ended, because now they've been labeled as a behavior problem, whereas likely the white ally who can choose or not choose to do this work and can do it nicely advances within the organization. And this plays out repeatedly in all of our workplaces. So why is the disruption often not tolerated? Organizations, knowingly or not, often actually want a physical mosaic, but a mental and behavioral melting pot. That is, their preference would actually be to maintain the hegemony, okay? So what do I mean by this? Sometimes this is referred to as the Noah's Ark approach to diversity. We need 2 of those, 2 of these, and 2 of those. But the job descriptions and the hiring practices have to be the same for everybody. The clue that that is sending is that we actually want you to have the same training as us, we want you to think like us, and we want you to act like us, okay? That's what I mean by the hegemony. That is not a practice that leads to, creates, or supports the organizational change that we're talking about. Now, why don't then organizations hire based on the value add that a diverse group of Black or Indigenous people would bring to their organization, right? That value add is rooted in our different life and family experiences, our cultural and community connections, the different worldviews that we bring to the table, the academic experiences and studies that we have, which are often quite diverse. And I would suggest that part of the reason that we don't do that is that quite often organizations do believe a single story and thus fail to imagine that things can actually be different and be better. So, has anyone here watched the TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie on the danger of a single story?
Yes.
Yeah, we all should. And then you should also watch her one on why we all should be feminists. So a single story is incredibly limiting, particularly when the story is about stereotypes of Indigenous people and our potential for Indigenous achievement or advancement, which is also a covert or hidden story of white supremacy that needs to be maintained. That this organization, whether I'm talking about the academic institution or the healthcare clinic or the hospital, can only do the job we have to do if we maintain our superior position of Western knowledge, if we maintain our leadership, if these are the qualifications and skills that we have around the table. How this sounds sometimes in organizations, so for example, if we're thinking about boards, are discussions like, we can't trade off qualifications for representation, right? It often sounds like we need a skills-based board, not a representative board. And what that is actually saying is we can't have both. Like, we don't actually believe we could have a representative number of Indigenous people around the table and have the skills that we need. There are 2 problems with that, at least 2 problems with that. First of all, it fails to acknowledge that actually that diverse group of Indigenous people or Black people, whatever representative group that we're talking about, actually does have knowledge, skills, and qualifications to sit around the table. That there are myriad stories of knowledge, skills, and qualifications that we possess. The second limiting belief around that is that you know what those knowledge, skills, and qualifications are. Actually, part of the reason organizations can't see us as qualified is because they don't understand the qualifications that we bring that are not just about like recreating like in a mainstream organization. Now, if you read any of the business literature or studies like that, you would also know that there is a ton of evidence that having more women in leadership and having more diverse racialized groups in leadership creates better outcomes across business types or across institutions. So we fundamentally need to be able to challenge the single stories that are driving our current business practices and operations. And the last one that I'm going to mention for today, because I actually had more like a list of 20 that I had to narrow down, is that organizations don't understand that for us, time is of the essence. And they enforce the privileged timeline of slow-moving, institutional, incremental change. Now, we don't have time to waste, because while we're doing this, our children are being taken at intolerably high numbers, our learners are being harmed by the racism that they're experiencing, our relatives are being jailed unfairly and dying prematurely. That is the stakes that we are working with. So, moving forward, here are 3 things that I would ask the organizations that I work with to hopefully consider and embrace as we keep doing this work. The first is to get uncomfortable and don't let yourself off the hook. This happens in a lot of different ways, but we need you to be willing to sit in that discomfort if we're actually going to challenge these stories and do the root work of anti-racism. We have to have the tough conversations and we have to make the tough decisions. And this includes having conversations about who is being advantaged by the status quo and being brave enough to make the decisions to give up those systems of advantage. And the third thing is you don't get to check off any boxes. We only get to judge ourselves by the impacts and the outcomes we are achieving, not the checklist of tasks that we have done along the way. So I will say thank you for coming, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So, just given what the president said in his message on the 7th, and these 3 recommendations, what specifically could the U of M do right now?
So, if I were the U of M, one thing I would do right now is actually open up the conversation to governance and leadership. So, people who are not aware, representation on our board and Senate is actually a Manitoba legislative act. If we wanted to have structured representation of the highest level decision making in the university, we need to be able to get around those tables in critical mass effects where we can actually have the kind of influence we've been able to have to some degree at the Bannatyne campus. So there can't be a limit to the level of structural change that we are opening to co-create. We have to be able to have everything on the table. And Lisa knows that I have them because we talked about them. You know, one that I'll share, actually, is organizations are very willing to let us stand in the fire. and I will say this personally, but I know this also is true for many of my colleagues. We will stand in the fire in meeting rooms and boardrooms, presentations in the public eye, and we will take the heat, and we will stand there alone. It is rare that I've ever had a non-Indigenous ally, when I am taking the heat, deflect any of that. But then, at the same time, they will point to the work that I do, or that we do, as their shining examples of the organization's progress, after letting us stand in the fire alone. So that is one that I did not talk to, that I would specifically ask people to be very cautious about. It is not appropriate to put us on the poster if you're not standing in the fire with us.
Can I just make a comment?
Of course.
I was thinking back when I was living on the reserve at Sagging. There was so much racism that we were introduced to in town. All of the rules and the policies that the government had implemented for our families on reserves. Most of the people, or all of the people, accepted that behavior against us. So it was part of the norm. So growing up that way, it's kind of ingrained in all of us, I think. It's starting now to look at the way it is. What you're talking about, I think, is very crucial for the younger generation to see that. And it is my hope that, I don't know if it'll happen in my time, but it is my hope that my great-grandchildren will have a safer place to live and get a better education and feel comfortable and feel that they have a right in our country, in our province. Because at one time I didn't believe that. I thought being white, no matter if they were toothless and they were ugly, I thought they were the best.
Yeah.
That's a fact. That's
Yeah.
what I thought.
So, academically, we might refer to what Margaret is discussing as internalized racism. Like when members of oppressed groups start to believe the messages of their inferiority from the dominant group, right? And also a lot of the literature shows, and some of the studies we've done ourselves here, is that kids are internalizing those messages by ages 4 to 6, right? That kids will already have preference for white. My own kids, like McKenna right now is 5 and has talked several times recently about how she wishes we were more PG. That's because she is already internalizing these messages the way kids do through media, through who their teachers are, through what they see represented. And we did a study several years ago on Indigenous docs and about their experiences in medical school. Several of the study participants talked about how by the time they were 6, they had already internalized a belief that things would be better if they were blonde-haired and blue-eyed. One of the students said something very succinctly that was captured by a number of the other interviews, which is, you can't be Indigenous in medicine and succeed. You have to assimilate. And that belief comes from the pressures that our structures and our organizational culture put on students. And that is not what we want. We don't want to have numbers in the class that have them feel that pressure to assimilate, which they still do. Okay? We want to have numbers in the class. We want to value fully who they are and have it safe for them to be fully who they are while they're there. Yeah. That is the goal that we're aiming for. I don't know if we'll get there by the time my kids are here. They're 5 and 8 now. this took generations to create, but we can't wait that long to recreate it. Like collectively, we hold the power to recreate the situation that we have created and upheld to this point. Barry.
I just like to ask my white colleagues in the room to dialogue. Don't be afraid, okay? She did this actually for you. We're here just to support. We know this stuff. So please, my white colleagues, dialogue. And that means you're ready to learn about your positionality in the context of what Marcia is proposing here. Otherwise, this thing will not change. Okay, you have to know that. I've been here for 25 years. It's not changed. So please, in your conversations, talk about this kind of stuff.
So I really enjoyed today. I really enjoyed the challenge us to think about difficult questions. I get what you say about don't put this up there and post it unless we as stand in the fire. I get a lot of that. What would you like to see happen in terms of the change of attitude for people to stand in the fire?
Yeah.
Because in a sense, you're asking the reverse assimilation too. In a sense, you're asking sort of an empathy to embrace the empathy of what's in your mind, what your culture, the whole sort of history of everything. So I get that. But what would you say we have to do in order to be able to stand in the fire? What are some of the
So I'm not sure I follow what you meant about reverse assimilation, so maybe we can come.
I guess what I'll say is that and this sort of concept of assimilation is relatively new to me.
Okay.
And so I'm coming in from. So my understanding of assimilation is that you're being asked to do what we want you to do.
Okay.
And you want us to be more like you.
Okay.
So the reverse assimilation is that I'm saying, and I embrace it, I think we have to move in that other direction where we say, okay, so why can't I be Indigenous in my mind, in my spirit? Why can't I at least try and embrace an understanding a little bit more of just being content to say, well, we've achieved all these things, good for you, and go on your way. How do we then become part of, immersed in that culture too? Can we ever share that culture? Can we ever be part of it?
Okay, that was a lot of questions. But thank you for engaging in them and putting them out there. So, assimilation in the first part A, okay. So, the assimilationist policies of Canada were not about we want you to be like us. It was that we are superior to you and we require you to be like us for your continued survival in the Canadian state. It was a desire for full assimilation into the Canadian body politic by making things illegal, like traditional practices. Actually, there was a time when it was illegal for more than 3 Indigenous people to gather if it was like felt to be protest or resistance or anything like that. The residential schools clearly were specifically assimilationist. The kids couldn't speak their languages. It was trade or service-based education. Like, it was assimilation in that we no longer want you to exist as a separate people. We want you to be us. When I said stand in the fire, what I mean by that is for example, when we have a situation in which a non-Indigenous person is being racist, making racist statements, challenging Indigenous learners in inappropriate ways, behaving aggressively to Indigenous colleagues to try to diminish their voice, I would like my other non-Indigenous allies who also recognize that as inappropriate to say in that moment, this behavior is inappropriate. Instead of sitting there as a neutral observer and leaving the work of doing all of that to me. That's what I'm talking about. It is rooted in changing the acceptable behavior in a situation amongst a group, as opposed to asking somebody to be more like me. Like, that's a different thing. It's just that actually that kind of power over approach to communication that is driven by these ideas is inappropriate and should not be tolerated. And that message is received very differently when it comes from me, as someone who's racialized as Indigenous, well, than when it does as someone they perceive as their peer in that interaction. So I would like to see more of my non-Indigenous allies stepping into those conversations and holding their peers accountable when they are displaying behaviors that are about power over and are rooted in ideas of racial superiority and racial inferiority. That is the root of the message I was trying to give with that standing in the fire with us. That's about solidarity. That's about allyship the way that the Anti-Oppression Network defines allyship. So those are some of the comments I would make around that. There's another question here that I'm going to go to.
As a blonde-haired blue-eyed person, I am wondering if you have any recommendations for reading or learning for people who want to be allies, and also want to make sure that the microphone remains with the person impacted, the Indigenous person, but that we can still be allies and full allies.
So the Anti-Oppression Network is one. They have great resources around allyship. There is actually a librarian in Winnipeg named Monique Boromiak. Did I say that right? She runs a website called Groundwork for Change, and she has a ton of resources on allyship, and she has an excellent critical lens on it. So she's somebody that I would really kind of connect with, look at the website and see around that. You know, this, I understand this question of how do I both act to interrupt racism and then ensure I'm not taking over someone else's space, and I think that is something to be conscious of, but not to be held back by. I think that you can interrupt racism. That behavior is inappropriate. Can we take this offline? Can we talk about this outside? There are a number of ways that you can interrupt racism and leave space for Indigenous people to lead the dialogue of what needs to be created there instead. Right? I don't know any of my colleagues who want to do all of the work of interrupting racism. Like, that is something that we really need solid allies to take the lead on. Because again, as I've mentioned, when that comes from people who are perceived as peers, it's about peer accountability and shifting social norms as opposed to what is perceived as confrontation and destructive disruption from us, right? But as you do that work of challenging the whiteness and the racism and kind of dismantling the white supremacy, that frees us up to put our energy into our collective vision and our self-determining future and what we are building up and rising up in the space that's created there. I'm gonna go here, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, in point one, you kind of talked about Indigenous Achievement, anti-racism, and sort of these different languages institutions use without really knowing which one they want. And I wanted to ask what you thought, or if you have any thoughts about how institutions use this language versus how they might or should use it, like the language of indigenizing the university or decolonizing the university, and how that might link to those other ones.
Yeah. So the one thing I would say about this as a preamble is we don't all agree. Like there has not, and we all know this, I'm gonna give the facetious, but we all know there's not been like a grand meeting of Indigenous academics and community members that say, okay, now we're gonna decolonize, but next year we're gonna indigenize, right? So one thing